There's this idea that we're just antennas and that thought
Mm,
forms actually exist in the ether. You know, it's a little bit like the
sure.
collective consciousness again. I don't know if I believe that. You know, they don't know where thoughts come from. They don't know where they live. Memories are the cobbling together of sensory impressions. They don't live anywhere. So again, without getting too wacky and metaphysical, you know, imagination is everything.
Right.
Look at Da Vinci's sketches. It's always an idea first. There is a mechanical process to manifesting. Concept boards are just there to inspire. You know, a lot of the early concept boards, or I guess VizDev boards at Disney, were sometimes the only thing you had as a lighthouse. Every film I ever worked on there fell apart at some point, right? And then they take everybody off the one that's in full production and put them back on the one that's in trouble. So every film I've worked on did fall apart at some point. Sometimes all you need is that one piece of key art that keeps the crew inspired, and it becomes the beacon of the vision, if that makes sense. I'm creating like a madman because it's saving my life. I think there's a lot of people that are experiencing the catharsis of the creative process. So I often say, God, I'm just full of ideas. You know, when you hear stolen idea stories, it's like, well, don't you have another? And not everybody does, but I feel pretty blessed, you know what I mean, that I'm just kind of on fire and creating all day, every day. And I think of it as sort of just being primed, you know, being that antenna, so that when I walk down the street, I could see any juxtaposition of images, you know, maybe a poetic or an incongruous juxtaposition of images. And I just have to take an audio note, or I have to run home and thumbnail something. So maybe just being primed is the way to not really hit that wall and have empty canvas syndrome or blank page syndrome, if that makes sense. If I feel like I've hit a wall on a project and I've lost, I don't know, the inspiration, I think that's a big fear among a lot of people. And I've taught for 20 years. So I've, you know, counseled a lot of students in their creative process. A lot of people love the idea stage. They're very stimulated by that. But then maybe the execution, whether it's rendering or, do you know what I mean, doing 24 frames per second for animation, whatever it is, that can feel laborious. And then this fear sets in that, ooh, the initial inspiration that felt so soulful and inspiring and energizing has been lost. That's why I say study the creative process, because if you kind of see the value of all of them and bringing something to fruition and actually completing that circuit by speaking to people or landing or, you know, finding its audience, sometimes the drudgery is worthwhile and you see the big picture. Often, and again, in my teaching, I've seen this too, often if one doesn't know where one is headed and one doesn't do the foundational work, you know, build that story arc and those wants and needs and the, you know, thematic content and build the character arc. If you don't know where you're headed, it's very easy to lose your way and therefore lose your inspiration. So even though there is that fear, like I was saying, and this does apply, by the way, to any kind of visual storytelling, it doesn't have to be literature. It does apply, I think, to pretty much the creative process in general. If you know where you're headed, not only do you avoid those pitfalls of like feeling that you've lost your groove, yeah. But also it actually opens you up to being more intuitive along the way. So you can only be organic about your creative process and spontaneous if you have a foundation. So I would just say get to know all the trappings of each genre, you know what I mean, and the demands of it. It does help in the content of a portfolio. Do you know what I mean? It's not just style. It's not just style or voice. It's the whole intent behind it and how the story is being told. So of course that's more important for story artists, and you work in that arena. I was very linear as a kid. Like I was the dude who would just be a night owl. I'd work till 3 a.m. because I was so linear, and I also had completion issues. If I didn't have the closure of finishing something, I just couldn't sleep. So I was so linear and I had to just motor through and finish something. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, even if it means not eating or not sleeping. But Art Center really taught me to, yeah, put things on the back burner, but also juggle. And I wouldn't trade that for the world, man. You don't get that resolve or that closure of finishing. You know, and even in the industry, we've all heard it. When is it finished? Well, either when they pry it from your cold, dead hands, or when they say ship it, like it's called a deadline when the client needs it. So I do notice, I actually polled my students, when do you know a piece is finished? Sometimes we overwork pieces. Sometimes we let them go too soon without giving them enough love, you know? I know so many artists that will work on a piece more for their portfolio, even though it was already delivered to the client. So I think knowing when something is finished is an art. At Disney, thankfully, you know, if you were kind of nose to the grindstone and broiled in a background that was going to take 3 weeks, which, you know, I did one for Tarzan, it had 30 levels of foliage on cell. And, you know, a sky card can take you 15 minutes, but that kind of background where the audience is first seeing Gorilla Home and really needs to be introduced to it with all those levels could take 3 to 4 weeks. So luckily, you're kind of given the luxury of focusing like that. What does happen is if something's kind of approved, we had approved in the Friday meeting, either it was approved, it was back to the drawing board entirely, or it was improved with changes. Meaning the directors had faith, you would apply the tweaks and it was approved with fixes. But anyway, sometimes a piece would come back when you thought it was out of your life. You know, like a month later, like, oh, that one again. So yeah, flexibility is good. And, you know, luckily I had some great supervisors. And in Pocahontas, I joked, like, if I have to paint one more telephone pole-like tree, because they were so, I loved the look of it, but, you know, very Ivan DeRoll, very razor sharp on the edges and basically telephone poles. So I joked, like, I will jump out the window and or slit my wrists if I have to paint one more tree. But a great supervisor recognizes that and kind of gives you a change of scenery every now and then. As a viz dev artist, you just have to juggle and not be too attached to anything. So, you know, that's a tricky balance, isn't it? Kind of being inspired and putting the love into whatever the assignment is, finding the love in the challenge and literally falling in love with that character you just designed, but also being able to detach enough to shift focus with, I guess, the faith that is, when I come back to it, I'll have fresh eyes. You know, and then they do contact me regularly and say, what should I charge for, you know, A, B, C, and D? My first answer is I feel lucky because the illustration jobs I did, like for Putnam, Random House, Lowell House, Penguin, all the big five, I had the Society of Illustrators guidelines to tell me what to charge. So it's no mystery. Here's the going rate for a spot illustration. Here's the going rate for a single page illustration. Here's what a cover or a double page spread goes for. I observe those like a madman. So it tends to be per picture, if anything, or per project, if anything, but more likely work for hire, meaning we can fire you at the drop of a hat. So, you know, I hope the industry kind of swings back, but I hope I'm not all over the place here. But I do think with all of that in mind, it is very important to ask the right amount so you're not doing a disservice to all of those artists. It's important to keep asking more and more with each job until you're where you want to be. You might be looking at the union guidelines, and there is a handbook, so that's one answer. Just go to TAG, the Animation Guild, ask for, you might have to be a member to get it, I'm not sure, but try to get your hands on the union guidelines, the TAG guidelines. So of course, when you hit journeyman, it's negotiable, but everything up to that point is kind of a range that's dictated by the union. So it's a good thing to look at. That does help when you're pricing things. Society of Illustrators, you know, call an instructor like they call me, but I often just refer them to the Society of Illustrators guidelines or the TAG handbook. That, you know, it's very important to be a brand because with those short or just non-existent contracts I referred to, you got to have buoyancy. So whether it's, you know, selling your prints or sometimes doing a group show, which is what I do only when asked. I do group shows in a gallery setting. But to have all those tentacles out and just be a brand is more and more important. We all know that. All you need to do is go to CTN and see people that have a following on Instagram, are selling prints right and left, and they may or may not even want to work for a studio. Some of them, you know, work for a studio for a period of time and then really work on their brand. Creativity is my religion. And we're all creative. I would say that too, you know. mathematicians, engineers, my sister who gardens and is a chef. Like, we don't always recognize it. We like to kind of give that label creative to the visual, the arts, a painter, a sculptor, a writer. But I truly think being creative is integral to the human experience. It's in all of us, and for a reason.